How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yud Tes, Daf 19 of Masechta Menachos, friends. Okay, 2 sections today. Chavra, today feels like it's kind of like a normal page of Gemara. Wow. Remember those? Let's see how it goes. I mean, we'll see how long it is, but it feels like kind of normal. It's like, wow, okay, this is just kind of like relatively moving. Anyways, we'll see. We'll see. We'll see. We'll see. We'll see. We'll see. If it's not, it might just be much harder than other regular pages of Gemara. Just relatively speaking, it's more approachable. But anyways, 2 sections on today's daf. If the mincha oil must be poured by the priest, of course, this is based on the Mishnah that we learned. Was it yesterday? Yeah, the Mishnah that we learned yesterday, where we said that the oil must be poured. However, it does not must be poured by the kohen. It can be poured by a zar, by a non-kohen. We are going to discuss that. We see it's taka machlekes between the Chachamim and Reb Shimon. So we are going to work through that machlekes, and then we will discuss which steps of a mincha are required. Not directly. It's kind of going to be like a kind of sugya from which we get into the question of how do we know which steps of a korban mincha are required, must be done, as opposed to are not gonna be ma'akev if they are not done. That was probably a double negative, but anyways, which steps of the mincha are required? It should be a good daf. I think there's a bunch of stuff that we've probably seen before. Friends, let's jump in and let's learn Daf Yud Tes, Daf 19 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, we actually have a lot to do on Daf Yud Ches Amid Beis, because this machlekes starts now and doesn't really end until halfway through Yud Tes Amid Aleph, and I didn't want to stop in the middle, because then it takes a long time to just get caught up. So I figured let's just jump right into it now from the beginning. So we are on Daf Yud Ches Amid Beis. I'd say about 10-15 lines into the page. The last word on the line is lema. Let us say. You got it? Good. Lema mastisin d'lo Reb Shimon. Let's say that our Mishnah is unlike Reb Shimon. Our Mishnah that says that the yetzika, that the pouring of the oil on the mincha can be done by a zar. It does not need to be done by a kohen, right? Of course, there's the mixing bowl, some oil is added to the mixing bowl, some flour, some more oil, then it's mixed together, then some more oil. So the yitzika, the pouring of the oil, does not need to be done. I think it's specifically referring to the last yitzika, but anyways, that does not need to be done by a kohen. Now, this is unlike Reb Shimon, who says it must be done by the kohen. The sani that we learned in the Brayso, Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon, kol kohen she'eno modeh ba'avoda. Any kohen who does not admit to the avoda, eno chelik bekuna, he has no part in the kuna. So the Rambam actually writes this halacha in the first halacha of Hilchos Bikurim, the halachas of Bikurim, and he says there in the first halacha of Hilchos Bikurim that there are 24 matnos kuna, there are 24 gifts that are gifted to the kohen, and he says there that if a kohen does not admit to these gifts, does not accept, does not value, or what's the word? If he doesn't take part in these gifts, he says this is a joke or whatever. He doesn't give any sense of validity to the gifts. Well, then he's not part of the kuna and he doesn't get any gifts. So I think the point is that it's a similar vibe over here in terms of the avoda. If he kind of distances himself from the avoda, right, almost like the pasuk says, "Ma'avoda azos lachem," is the impression I'm getting, right? Like we say by the Rasha, so we say over here, so kol kohen she'eno modeh ba'avoda, any kohen who doesn't admit, doesn't agree with the avoda that he has the honor to have the privilege to do, eino chelik bekuna, so he has no part in the priesthood. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, hamakriv es dam hashlamim, that the one who offers the blood of the shlamim v'esachelev, and the fats mibnei Aharon, from the sons of Aharon, Losiya Shokayom and the Mana, will be able to receive as a portion the right thigh of the shlomim. Modeh ba'avoda yesh lo chelik b'kuna. Somebody who is modeh ba'avoda. What does Rashi say? Does it say anything? I thought Nukakoin as Amid Chashiv. Okay, anyways. There was like a Rashi that I was looking for. Okay. It's in the Shittim Kubetzes. Right, exactly. Shomer Bizarre. Okay. So Makav Dama Shlomim. Amode Ba'krovas Dama Shlomim. Lotia. Okay. Anyways, any Kohen who takes part and accepts the privilege to do the avoda of offering the korban shlomim, so then he receives a Rayesh lo chelik b'kuna she'enu mode ba'avoda. But if he distances himself from the avoda, ein lo chelik b'kuna ve'ein lo zo. So he has no portion in the priesthood. Now ve'ein li ela zo bavad. Now all I know is about the korban shlomim. That pasuk was amakav ezeva ezdama shlomim. That pasuk was specific in the context of shlomim. Minayin the rabbos tesvav avodas. How do we know to also include 15 other avodas? Hayitzikos, for example, pouring of the oil onto a korban mincha, vablilos, mixing the korban mincha, vapsisos, and breaking up baked/fried korban minchas, melichos, and salting minchas. Salt. We're going to talk about tomorrow. I think it's really salting the komets and the livona, but not the shiare amincha. Ve'atnufis, and waving, I guess, either menachos or any other korban, I imagine, that needs to be waved. Ve'hagoshes, and bringing, so it's talking about bringing the mincha to the mizbeach, which we're actually going to learn about on New Testament Beis a little bit, I think. Ve'hakmitzis, and taking the komets, ve'aktaris, and burning, I imagine, the komets, or really burning anything, I guess. Ve'amalikos, and doing malika on birds, kabbalas adam, ve'azos, and sprinkling the blood, ve'ashkoas sota, and giving the sota to drink from the sota waters, ve'arifas egla arufa, which is interesting what egla arufa is exactly doing there. My impression is that it's specific by egla arufa. It says, kaper la'amcha Yisrael, Asher padisos velo yishafek dam noki bekerev Yisrael, something like that. I think so. The Mishnah in the ninth parak of Masechta Sota, the Mishnayos describe the process of the ceremony, the Egla Rufa ceremony. I believe that specifically the part that is for the priests is for them to recite that portion about kaper lamcha Yisrael. Right. We say Hashem should atone for the Yidden. Okay. V'tyrus mitzora, and the purification of a mitzora, v'nesios kapayim beimi b'fnim beimi b'chutz, and blessing the people, whether we're talking about in the Beis Hamikdash or just in anywhere in all cities of Eretz Yisrael. Minayin, how do we know that all of these avodas are also done by the priests? Talmud loymar. And that if they are sort of, a priest distances himself from such avoda, he has no portion in the priesthood. That when it comes to any avoda that is given to the priests, any kohen who does not admit to it, who does not agree with it, who distances himself from it, has no portion in the priesthood. Okay, no. So the question is, our Mishnah says that a non-priest can do the yetzika, the pouring of the oil, and yet Reb Shimon has a very sort of strong position about priests who distance themselves from the avoda, and one of those avodas that the priests must jump to do is the pouring of the oil onto a korban mincha. So we see that this is one of the avodas that a priest needs to do, and if he distances himself and allows a czar to do it, well, then we would distance him, the priest, from the priesthood. So therefore, it sounds like, according to Reb Shimon, a priest would have to do the yitzika, unlike our Mishnah, which says that a non-priest, a czar, can do the pouring of the oil on the mincha. Rav Nachman says, Rav Nachman, lo kasha, no problem. Kan b'minchas koyanim, kan b'minchas Yisrael. Says Rav Nachman, the difference is if we're talking about a minchas kohanim or a minchas Yisrael. By minchas Yisrael, there's kmitza. By minchas kohanim, there's no kmitza because it's entirely burnt on the mizbeach. Right? Even if a kohen says, I'm going to bring a minchas solis, it's entirely burnt on the mizbeach. There's no kometz there. There's no shiari mincha there. By minchas Yisrael, there is a kometz. And only the kometz is burnt on the mizbeach, and the shiari mincha are eaten by the kohanim by minchas Yisrael. So again, Rav Nachman lo kasher kan b'minchas kohanim kan b'minchas Yisrael. It depends if we're talking about a minchas kohanim or minchas Yisrael. Minchas Yisrael, when it comes to a korban mincha of a zar, debas kmitza, that kmitza is performed mikmitza ve'elach mitzvas kuna. So only from kmitza and on does the priest need to do it, right? As the pasuk says, "V'vi'al b'nei aharon ha'kohanim v'komatz." Right? I just read from the pasuk that the pasuk says that the mixing bowl will be brought to the b'nei aharon ha'kohanim, and then at that point the b'nei aharon ha'kohanim will take the kometz. From that point on, mikmitza ve'elach, from that point on, priests are required. But Limed al Yitziko Vlila teaches, however, about the pouring of the oil, the mixing of the flour and the oil, the mincha, sheksher bizarre, that would be permitted to be performed by a zar, by a non-kohen. Minchas kohanim, however, the korban mincha of a priest, on the other hand, dilabas kmitza where no kmitza is performed, it's simply entirely burnt on the altar. Me'ikara boya kuna, so that needs kohanim from step one. And if the kohanim distance themselves and what's the word? I'm keep on struggling to get a word to use over here. The kohanim kind of ridicule. I'm probably not going to stick with that word, but act negatively towards the opportunity to do yitzika and blila for the menachos of kohanim. So that is where Reb Shimon says that they have no portion in the priesthood. However, when it comes to minchas Yisrael, where there is a kometz, the kohanim only take over from the kometz and on. But before then, like the yitzika and blila, there is no problem for a kohen to allow a zar to do those steps. Omar le Rove, but Rove says to Rav Nachman, Michdei, minchas kohanim eicha is rabbi yitzika. How do we know bichlal that by minchas kohanim there even is yitzika, that you pour oil on a minchas kohanim? The answer is minchas Yisrael, from the mincha of Yisrael, because the pasuk says by, I think it's coming based on this pasuk, that it says by minchas machvas, which is in the context of, the Torah is talking about minchas machvas. If anybody brings a minchas machvas, when the Torah talks about minchas kohanim, it talks specifically about minchas kohanim. But minchas machvas is talking about a general minchas machvas, whoever brings it. And it says over there, pasuk soisapitim. I'm reading from the pasuk, v'yatzakto alei Hashem in minchai, and we will pour oil on it. And we say that applies not just to minchas machvas, but to all menachos, including minchas kohanim. So again, I'm reading again. Omar Rove, it says Rove Michdei minchas kohanim eicha is rabbi liyitzika. How do we know that the menachos of priests requires pouring of the oil? Minchas Yisrael, from the mincha v'yid, and therefore of a zar. Ma osam ksherer bizar, av ochanami ksherer bizar. So Rava argues that just like by the yitzika and the blila of a mincha of a zar, that is allowed to be done by a zar, so also the minchas kohanim, which is learned from the mincha of a zar, the yitzika and the blila, can be done by a zar there as well. So Rav Nachman wanted to make a distinction and say that when Reb Shimon requires kohanim to do the yitzika of blila, it is by a minchas kohanim. Rava pushes back and says that no, I would think that even by a minchas kohanim, a zar should be able to do yitzika uvlila. Igadam, those who say Rav Nachman, that Rav Nachman had said not that the distinction is between whether we're talking about the mincha of a kohen or the mincha of a zar. Rather, lo kasha kan nikmatzos kan b'shein nikmatzos. We're talking about minchas that are kometz versus minchas that are not kometz. to include in minchas that are not kometz, not just menachos of Kohanim, but also minchas nesachim, for example. That when it comes to a mincha that is kometz, so then Yisrael's zars would be allowed to do the yitzika of lila, and only from the kmitza and onward would the kohen be required. But minchas that are not kometz, the kohen would be required from step one, and that's what Reb Shimon is talking about, according to Rav Nachman. Amalei Rave, and Rave says to Rav Nachman, Michdei, let us see. She'ein nikmatzos mehecha is Rabbe. How do we know that liyitzika? How do we know that menachas that are not kmitzad also require yitzika? Minikmatzos, from the menachos that are nikmatzos, i.e., from Yisrael's. So therefore, kinikmatzos. Therefore, the minchas of Kohanim and the minchas nesachim should be like the menachas of zars, the menachas that are kometz. Ma'osam ksher bezar, just like when it's kometz, the yitzika of lila is ksher bezar. Af achanami, also by the mincha of a kohen or by minchas nesachim, ksher bezar, the yitzika of lila is ksher bezar. No, so Rava pushes back and he says that no, I would think that all minachis, whether they are kometz, whether they are not kometz, the yitzika of lila should be kshera bezar. So in that, if that's the case, then if the yitzika of lila is kshera bezar, regardless of if it's kometz or not, well then where is there room for Reb Shimon to say that it is possible bezar, that a kohen must do the yitzika of lila? So rather, ela machvata maslisin d'lo Reb Shimon. Rather, it makes sense to say that simply Reb Shimon would argue, and he just simply holds that by no menachis are you allowed to do yitzika, is a zar allowed to do yitzika of lila. A kohen must be the one to pour the oil and mix the mincha, and that applies to all menachis, and Reb Shimon simply argues with our Mishnah. Now, frag the Gemara, my time of the Rabbanon, how come the rabbis say that you are allowed to do yitzika uvlila bezar? Amarka, well, quite simply, the pasuk says v'yotzak alei shemen v'rosan alei levona. Okay, somebody will put oil on, somebody will put levona on. Ve'avia el bnei aharon hakoyanim v'komatz. Subsequently, that means afterwards, I think. Afterwards, after the yitzika, after the levona and the blila, I think, the mincha will then be brought to the kohen, v'kometz, at which point the kohen, having received the mixing bowl, will take the kometz. Mikmitza ve'elach mitzvah skuna. Only from kmitza and onwards, that is where the kohen gets involved, must get involved. Limera yitzika v'lila sheksher bazar, which teaches that the yitzika, the pouring of the oil, the mixing of the mincha as well, kshera bizar. Reb Shimon, bnei aharon hakayanim, mikra nidrash lefanav v'la'acharab. Reb Shimon, however, says, Reb Shimon disagrees with that analysis, says the Mishnah, says the Gemara. Reb Shimon disagrees with that analysis. Rather, he looks at the pasuk and he says, look, we have, let's say, three sections of the pasuk. Right? You have V'yotzak alei Hashem v'nosan alei levona. That's like one section. And then it says V'via el bnei aharon. Then you have the bnei aharon section. Then right afterwards it says V'komatz, and you have kmitza. So you have the yitzika, you have the kohanim, and then you have the kometz. Yitzika, kohanim, kometz. So we assumed that only the kohanim are only relevant once they're introduced. So there's the yitzika, anybody could do that. Then we introduce the kohanim, and from that point on, that's what they need to do. And therefore the kometz, which is after that, is already done by the kohanim because they've now been introduced, and therefore they do the kometz. Reb Shimon disagrees with that analysis, and what he would say is that the kohanim, who are in the middle of this verses really, they're in the middle of these words, sections, their influence is not just on what is after their introduction, but even for what is before they've been introduced. I.e., the Yitzika also needs to be done with the Kohanim. That it says Yitzika, it says Kohanim, it says Kometz. The Kohanim in the middle there applies to not just what is after them, but also what's before them. Not just to the Kometz, but also to the Yitzika, which was mentioned before they were introduced. That also must be done with the Kohanim. Again, Reb Shimon, Bnei Aharon HaKohanim, when it says Bnei Aharon HaKohanim, it's Mikra Nitrash Lifonav Ulachariv. Not just Lachariv, not just for the Kohanim are not relevant just for the Kmitza that's afterwards, but even for the Yitzika that precedes. But one second, does Reb Shimon really hold this way? Does Reb Shimon really hold that verses are expounded before, in addition to what's after them, but also what's before them? We learn in a brisa that the pasuk says by a korban chatos. Now, the important words, the key words to look out for over here. I feel like I hear something. 1 second. Am I hearing something? I feel like it's probably my neighbor, like watering the plants or something. But I don't know. I can't tell. The key words in over here by the korban chatos are vilokach, etzba'o, and vinosan. Vilokach is Kabbalah Sadam. Etzbo means his finger. And we've learned in the past, even recently, we've learned, what was it, on Daf Yud or something. Let's see, do we see over here? I know, we learned recently that whenever it says Etzba, it means right hand. Okay? So it says Vilokach, which means Kabbalah Sadam. It says Etzba, which means right hand. And then it says Vinosan, which is Zrika Sadam. So etzba is right there in the middle, which means right hand. The question is, what requires the Kohen to use his right hand? So we have a similar breakup. I feel like the words I need today are just not coming. We have a similar framework or something. Template is maybe a better word, right? We have etzba, which is the right hand requirement in the middle. We have Kabbalah Sadam before it, and we have Zrika Sadam after it. And the question is, what requires the right hand? So everyone is going to agree that the Zrika Sadam requires the right hand, or in the case of the Chatas, applying the blood to the corners of to the horns of the Mizbeach requires the right hand, because that comes after the word Etzba. So everyone agrees that the application of the blood on the Mizbeach is going to require the right hand. What about Kabbalah Sadam, which precedes the word etzba? So again, velokach hakohen. So velokach, which is one of the key words, that's Kabbalah Sadam. Hakohen midam achatos be'etzba'o, another key word that that's the right hand requirement. Vinosan, zrika sadam / applying the blood to the mizbeach chitzon for the korban chatos. That's the third key word. So al karnos mizbeach, on the horns of the mizbeach. Now, be'etzba'o velokach, says the Tanakama that we will include vilokach with the requirement of be'etzbo, i.e., milamet shalote kabbalah ela b'yomin, that Kabbalah Sadam must be done with the Kohen's right hand. Be'etzbo v'nosan, and we also group together v'nosan, Zrika Sadam, with be'etzbo, milamet shalote nisino ela b'yomin, that the application of the blood on the horns of the Mizbeach must also be done with the right hand. I.e., the Tanakama is darshaning the pasuk before and afterwards. Amar Reb Shimon, but now Reb Shimon replies and he responds, V'chi nemar yad b'Kabbalah. It doesn't say yad, it doesn't say right hand, i.e. etzba by Kabbalah. Hov lo nemar yad b'Kabbalah, keep up a small kosher. Reb Shimon disagrees, says no, it doesn't say. There's no requirement for the Kohen to use his right hand for Kabbalah, which is written before the word etzba. And therefore, since there is no requirement for the right hand for Kabbalah Sadam, therefore, even if the Kohen did Kabbalah Sadam with his left hand, the korban is kosher. It says Abai, what's the machlokes between the Tanakam and Reb Shimon? Exactly our topic. Is a verse expounded only for what's afterwards, or can it even apply to what's before? I.e., in our case, the word right, the requirement for the right hand, is it only for Zrikas Adam, which is afterwards, or even for Kabbalas Adam, which is written beforehand? Reb Shimon says it's only for afterwards. Tanakama says for beforehand. So therefore, it seems that Reb Shimon's opinion is that a verse can only be expounded la'acharav, afterwards. Well, if that's the case, then going back to our scenario where we have Yitzika and then the Kohen and then Kmitza, Reb Shimon would say, in terms of how to expound the pasuk, he would say that the requirement for a Kohen would be only for the Kmitza. So how does he therefore learn that there's a requirement for a Kohen also for the Yitzika, which was written before the Kohanim were introduced? So Ela Achitaima, the Reb Shimon, this is why Reb Shimon requires the Kohanim to do Yitzika, because the pasuk says, I'm going to read you from the Psukim, the pasuk says, V'yotzak alei Hashemin, v'nosan alei levona, the Yitzika, the Blila, the levona, v'hevia el b'nei Aharon Kohanim v'kamatz. It says v'hevia, there's a vav there, connecting the two verses, to make them all one unit. And therefore to say that just like the Bnei Aharon Kohanim are relevant to the Kmitza, they're also relevant to the Yitzika, because it's all one topic, because of that vav that's connecting the two verses. V'hevia vav, most of Alin in Rishon, that vav at the beginning of v'hevia is adding on to the earlier verse to make it all one topic, and a Kohen is required for all of it. B'sav Reb Shimon vav mosif al inyan rishon. Does Reb Shimon really hold that the vav adds to the earlier topic, and that it's all right? That it's all one, and the requirement for a Kohen is for all of it. Elamiyata. But if that's the case, dichsiv v'shachad is ben abokar. That the pasuk says v'shachad is ben abokar, which we assume that, right? This is by what? This is by a korban ola, right? Yeah, it's right at the beginning of the book of Leviticus. It says v'shachad is ben abokar. We say that shchita is ksher bizarre. It says v'krivu b'nei Aharon koyanim ezdam. That only from Kabbalas Adam it says b'nei Aharon koyanim. V'zarku Adam, and then they'll do zrikas Adam. Mikabala ve'elach mitzvahs kuna. Right? It says v'krivu b'nei Aharon koyanim. That we only see the b'nei Aharon koyanim introduced by v'krivu, by Kabbalas Adam. That's where they're introduced. Mikabala ve'elach mitzvahs kuna. That only from Kabbalas Adam and onwards do you need a kohen. Melamed al shchita shekshera bizarre. And it teaches that the shchita, however, which precedes the Kabbalas Adam, you don't yet need a kohen. It's kshera bizarre. Now, Ila Reb Shimon, vav mosif al inyan rishon. Now, if Reb Shimon says that a vav connects everything together, to say that actually the kohen requirement applies to the whole pasuk, including the shchita, so shchita achinami bizarte psula. Well, then the shchita would have to be done by a kohen, just like the Kabbalah, and the zrika needs to be done by a kohen. The shchita as well, because the vav is connecting all parts of the pasuk. So shchita would have to be done by a kohen, and it would be psula bizarre. Shiny awesome. The Gemara says ein achinami, but over there the Amar Krav v'samach v'shachat. The previous verse had said v'samach yada rosh ola, and then this verse says v'shachad is ben abakar. So just like the smicha is not done by the kohen, it's done by the owner of the korban, the one who's bringing the korban. So just like the smicha in the previous pasuk is done by the owner, so also the shchita in the subsequent pasuk is done by the same person, and only once it says bnei Aharon by the Kabbalah, at that point are they introduced. V'samach v'shachad masmicha bizarim. Just like the smicha is bizarim by the owner, whoever that owner is, even if he's a non-priest, also the shchita can be done by the owner, even if he's a non-priest. Ima smicha bebailim av shchita bebailim. Okay. So then let's suggest that, okay, well, just like the smicha must be done by the owners, so therefore let's say that the shchita must be done by the owners. Right, we're saying v'samach v'shachat, just like the smicha is done by a zar, the shchita is done by a zar. Well, let me say that just like the smicha must be done by the owners, the shchita must be done by the owners. and a kohen can't do the shchita. No, that you cannot say. Kavachomer mazrika the ikr kapara lo bayabaylim. When it comes to zrika sadam, which is the key, that's the crucial element of a korban, as we know. Ki adamu banefesh yichaper. The zrika sadam is the key element here by a korban. Not the burning, not the eating. The zrika sadam, that's the key element. And yet, there's no requirement for the owners to do the key element of zrika sadam. And therefore, shchita delav ikr kapara, shchita, which is not the key element in the kapara, in the whole purpose of the korban, lo kol shekain, certainly it doesn't require the owner, and the kohen is able to do that as well. And therefore, the shchita does not have to be done by the owner, it can be done by the kohen. V'chi tema ain't done in efsher mishi efsher. And if you're going to say, yeah, but come on, we can't compare those two. The owners are unable to do the zrikas sadam because it says v'zarku b'nei ahar and akayanim. The pasuk says specifically that the b'nei ahar and akayanim are the ones doing the zrikas sadam. So Izar, who's the owner of the korban, has no choice. He's unable to do the zrikas sadam. But by the shchita, he's able to do zrikas sadam. Maybe he should have to do. I'm sorry. By the shchita, he's able to do the shchita. Maybe he should have to do the shchita. We said, okay, well, look at this. When it comes to Yom Kippur, the pasuk specifically says there, "V'shachad is parachatas asher lo." Specifically on Yom Kippur, the Torah is explicit that Ahar Kohen slaughters, right, does the shchita for his own korban. That's the only place where the Torah is specific of a person doing a korban for their own shchita for their own korban. Michal the shchita ba'alma lo b'inan bailim, which therefore implies that in general, shchita does not need to be done by the owners, and it can be done by the kohen. So therefore, what exactly is the machlokes between the Chachamim and Reb Shimon? The Chachamim say, look, when it comes to kmitza, it says ve'kriv, was it ve'avia el b'nei ahar nekayanim v'kamatz. The Chachamim say, look, the Kohanim are only introduced. The Chacham said the Kohanim are only introduced in the context of the Kmitza, that's it. The Yitzika, which happens beforehand, the Belili, which happens beforehand, does not need to be done by the Kohen, only the Kmitza. Reb Shimon says, but because it says Ve'evia, it's connecting both Psukim together. And therefore, just like the Kmitza is with the Kohen, so is the Yitzika, and so is the Belila. What about by Shchita, where it says Ve'krivu b'nei ahar nekayanim es adam, where it says by Kabbalah Sadam ve'krivu, would Reb Shimon say that the vav is adding to the shchita and that shchita must also be done by the kohanim? We say no. There it is different, because since the Torah specifically connects the smicha and the shchita together, so just like the smicha is done by the owner, so can the shchita be done by the owner. Anyways, basically, shchita is a unique scenario, but when it comes to yitzika and blila of a korban mincha, Reb Shimon would say that the ve'havia, the vav, connects everything together, and therefore not just the kmitza, but the yitzika, the blila, all of that must be done by the kohen according to Reb Shimon. Now we move on to the next section of today's daf. Which steps of a mincha are required? Now, the Gemara really jumps into almost a different discussion about things that are required in general, and via this sort of general discussion about things, how do we know when things are required, we land on how do we know which aspects of a mincha are required. So now, it says the Gemara, Amar Rav, says Rav, Kol Makom Shenemar Torah v'chuka eno el la'akiv, that whenever a pasuk says the word Torah and the word chuka, it means you must do it. You can't compromise on any elements of that mitzvah. So initially we thought to understand, Rav, that you need a pasuk to say both of the words for those words. For example, the first pasuk in, or maybe the second pasuk in Parshas Chukas. Let me see, which verse is this? Yeah, probably the second verse in Parshas Chukas is Zos Chukas HaTorah. So it says Chuka and it says Torah. So we thought to say that when Rav makes a statement that when it says Torah and Chuka, then there is no room for compromise on the details of that mitzvah. It would have to say Torah and Chuka in the same verse. But question, what about a Nazir? Delo ksiva bei ela Torah. It says Torah. What is it? Okay, I'm not going to refer. We're going to see a lot of verses now, so I'm not going to reference every single verse. I'll probably just read the Gemara so that we can get more of a flow. So when it comes to Nazir, it says Torah. Take my word for it. These are all. The Torah does in fact say Torah when it says Nazir. Okay, so by Nazir it says the word Torah. It doesn't say Chuka, but it says the word Torah. V'amar Rav, and says Rav Tnufa b'Nazir me'akeves. That when it comes to the Tnufa by the Korban Shlamim of a Nazir, the Ale Nazir, so says Rav that the Tnufa, the waving of the Shok, where was it? The Shok, the what's it called? The is it called what's it called by the Nazir that goes to the Kohen? Oh boy, the Ale Nazir, the something the Zroa b'Shela. So that Zroa b'Shela, as well as the one challah and one rakik of the korban as well. I don't remember if also the chazeh as well. Anyways, they are held together. The kohen and the Nazir holds them together and they wave them around. So that tnufa must be done. Now by a Nazir, all it says is Torah. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't say chuka. So Shani Osam, it's different over there. Kevan dichsiv kain yaise. It says at the end of the verse kain yaise. So kiman dichsiva behu chuka. So kain yaise. This is how it's done. Is similar to chuka. This is a law that must be done. So therefore, that is why Rav says it's ma'ake. Very tichsiv behu chuka dami. Hare toda. Okay, but what about a korban? Toda delo ksiva bei ela Torah. All it says is Torah by a korban toda. Vitnan, and we learn in a Mishnah in around the week from now, Daf Chav Zayin, there's a Mishnah that says, Arba minin shabatoda ma'akvin zeh, that the four, you have to offer all four breads, all four types of breads when it comes to a korban toda. Even though all it says is Torah, it doesn't say chuka. Shiny Toda is different to Iskash the Nazir. Well, Toda is compared to Nazir. Tichsiv al Zevach Todas Shlamav. By the Korban Toda, it says al Zevach Todas Shlamav. V'amar Shlamav l'Rabus Shalmei Nazir. Shlamav, plural, to include the Shlamim of a Korban Nazir as well. And since a Nazir, we said, is Ma'akev, so also by the Toda, the breads are Ma'akev. Vare Mitzorah. What about Mitzorah? Deloksiv Bei Ela Torah. It says Zos Tia Torah Sa Mitzorah. It doesn't say anything about Chok. Vitnan, and we also learn in that Mishnah on Daf Chav Zayin, Arba As Minin Sheba Mitzorah Ma'akmin Zeh, that the Eitz Erez, Shni, Tolas, and Siporim of a Mitzorah, you have to have all four of them on the day that he begins his purification process. Even though all it says is Torah. Shiny also, it's different over there. Dichsiv, Kevin Dichsiv, Zos Tiyeh, Torah Samitzorah Command Dichsiv Bechukadami, because it says Tiyeh, just like so. So therefore, that means that it's Makav, that you need all four of them. Bare Yom Kippurim, what about Yom Kippur? Dilochsiv Be Ele Chuka, all it says is Chuka. Doesn't say Torah, Vitnan, and we learn in that same Mishnah on Daf Chav Zayin, Shnei Sirei Yom Kippur Ma'akvin Zeh, that the two goats of Yom Kippur, the Sar LaHashem and the Sar LaAzazel, you have to have both. You can't just have one of them. You have to have both of them. Shnei Sirei Yom, okay, Zeh. So Ella, okay, no. So even though all it says is Chuka there, we still see that it's Ma'akev. You have to do both goats. Ella, okay. Oh Torah, oh Chuka. Okay, you know what? All right, let's pivot. If it says Torah or if it says Chuka, then it's Ma'akev. And that explains why by Yom Kippur, where it just says chukah, you need both goats. Shar korbanos t'chsiv Torah. Okay, but what about all the other korbanos where it says Torah? Right? I'll read you this pasuk. This pasuk says v'zosa Torah la'ola la'mincha v'lachatos v'la'oshom v'la'milurim v'la'zevach hashlamim. Right? There's a pasuk that says Torah, and it lists basically all the korbanos. V'lo ma'akve, and by korbanos we're not ma'akev on every last detail. Right? For example, by a mincha, right? We said in the Mishnah that if you didn't do agasha, it's okay. Right? Did we say that in our Mishnah? Was agasha on the list? I mean, Lohigish was on that list. Also by other korbanos, if you didn't burn the emurim, they're still kosher because the main thing is the zrika sadam. So kilu, even though it says Torah by korbanos, we don't have to do every single detail. So the Gemara answers, Torah baya chukah v'chukah lo baya Torah. Okay, when it says Torah, that's not enough. It would have to be Torah and chukah. But chukah, like on Yom Kippur, chukah alone is enough. Torah v'chukah ka'amar. But Rav had said, what did Rav say? What was his statement? Amar Rav kol makom shneimar Torah v'chukah. Both of them. So this is what Rav's saying. Afal gav d'chsiv Torah, even though it says Torah, iksiva chukah, if it also says chukah in, then yes, v'lo lo. But when it comes to chukah alone, that could be enough. Torah requires chukah, then you need both of them, but chukah alone could be enough. V'arei mincha d'chsiv ba chukah. Okay. But by korban mincha, it says chukah. V'amar Rav, it says Rav kol makom shehechzir hakosuf b'Torah b'Torah's mincha eno el la'akib. This is the key right here, by the way. This whole discussion that we've had about chukah, Torah, it's for this line, at least as far as I can tell. The point is for this line to teach us about what is required when it comes to menachos. Says Rav, kol makom shehechzir hakosuf b'Torah's mincha eno el la'akib. In the book of Leviticus, in Sefer Vayikra, Perek Beis, it talks about menachos. In the 6th chapter of Leviticus, Perek Vav, it also talks about menachos a second time. And says Rav, anything that was repeated, anything that was mentioned initially in chapter Beis and repeated in chapter Vav, those are the things that are ma'akiv. Those are the things that are musts, are required, they must be done. Anything that was mentioned just once must be done. Doesn't need to be done. Okay, so V'amar Rav, says Rav, kol makom she'echzir hakosuf b'Torah, wherever the Torah repeated in Perek Vav about menachos, b'Torah's mincha, eno ela la'akiv. That is me'akiv. Hechzer in lo, hechzer lo, which means that only the things that were repeated are required. Things that were not repeated are not required. Now, even though by the mincha it says chukah, apparently not everything is required. Shiny awesome, it's different when it comes to mincha d'chiksiva chukah. When it says chukah ba'achila ksiva, it's chukah is only by the achila, and therefore it doesn't apply to all of the details of the mincha. V'arei lechem hapanim. But what about lechem hapanim? D'chi ksiva chukah achila ksiva. By the lechem hapanim, by the showbreads, it says chukah in the context of eating it. V'tanan, and we learned in that same Mishnah, Daf Chav Zayin, Shnei Sidari Makmin Zezeh, you need both of the columns, both stacks of showbreads. Of course, there were 2 stacks of showbreads, 6 showbreads on each. You need both stacks. Shnei Bazichin Makmin Zezeh, also, of course, we know there were 2 of these Bazichin, these. I should have gotten photos of these bazichin. I have photos of the mizraks that we're going to see soon. But bazichin, I think all these. The thing is, I think these vessels are a little bit like unclear what they are. But I don't know. I've seen these bazichin. I feel like I've seen different. I think I've seen different images of what these bazichin could look like. Anything from from a serving spoon, like ladle, more of like a serving spoon even than like a ladle, to kind of. I don't even know. Anyways, and it's like some kind of container of sort of like almost like a small jug kind of thing, some kind of container to be able to hold frankincense. Anyways, so bazichin machmin, you need both of these bazichin, hasdarin v'abazichin machmin zeh, and also you need to have the stacks as well as the bazichin. Ella So even though it says chukah in the context of eating, we're still saying that everything's ma'akev when it comes to the showbreads. So So rather, you know what? When it says chukah, regardless of where it's written, it means you got to do all of the details. Okay, if that's the case, then how do we explain by the mincha where it says chukah, and we're saying that you don't have to do all the detail, right? Only the things that were repeated you have to do. The things that weren't repeated you don't have to do. Shiny awesome, it's different when it comes to mincha, the amarka, migirsa umishamna. The pasuk could have just said migeres umishemen, but it says migirsa umishamna, geres v'shemen ma'akvin ve'ein davar acher ma'akiv, to say that specifically the flour and the oil, those are the things that are ma'akev by mincha, but not any of the other things. So even though, yes, in general, chukah would mean that everything is required, but because the pasuk specifically says girsa v'shamna, it says it puts the focus specifically on the flour and the oil. Gufa Marab, Rab had said, Kol makom she'echzir l'cha akasuv b'toras mincha enu el la'akev. Rav had said that we've just been discussing that whenever it comes to the korban mincha, any halachas by the mincha that were repeated in chapter 6, those are the things that are musts. Ushmuel says Shmuel geres v'shemen ma'akvin ve'in davar acher ma'akev. And says Shmuel that no, only the oil and the flour are ma'akev, nothing else. But one second, according to Shmuel, even when the Torah repeats something by korban mincha, even though it's repeated, Shmuel will say it's not me'akev. No, everyone agrees, like Rav says, that whenever the Torah says it once in chapter 2 and then repeats it in chapter 6, you gotta do it. They're arguing about that the pasuk says in chapter 2 milo kumtso when describing the komets, and in chapter 6 it says bikumtso when describing the komets. And actually, what we learned from that is actually the Tanya milo kumtso bikumtso. Right, in one place it says milo kumtso, the other place it says bikumtso. Shelo yaisa mida lekomets. It means, from what we learned from there, is actually that you have to use your hand to separate the komets from the mixing bowl. You can't make a vessel to do that for you and should just use the vessel. You got to get dirty. You got to get oily. You got to stick your hand into that mixing bowl and pull out a komets. Rav says, Nami Tana Be Kra. And Rav says, this concept that you have to use your hand, that you can't make a vessel to do it for you, this is repeated. Where is this repeated? It's repeated because, again, I think the way I understand it is, the point is that from Melo Kumtso and Bikumtso, we're not learning that the step of the komets is required, but rather that the komets needs to be taken by hand. Meaning that what we learn out from Melo Kumtso and Bikumtso is that the komets needs to be taken by hand. However, that's just teaching that concept. Where has that concept been doubled down on? Where has it been repeated to say that this concept of using your hand for a komets is actually me'akev? You got to do it this way, and you can't use a vessel. So it says in the pasuk by the Chanukas Amishkan in Parshas Tzav, it describes that at the Chanukas Amishkan, Aharon offered a korban mincha, and it says, Aharon offered the mincha, and he took a komets in his hand. So Rav says, you see, not only do we learn from Milo Kumso and Bikumso that a komets should be taken with your hand, but then it says the Vayakar mincha by the Chanukas Mishkan that Aharon used his hand to do the kmitza. So we see that it is a requirement. Ushmuel Doris Mishal Lo Yafinon, whereas Shmuel says the inauguration of the Mishkan was a one-time event. We can't learn out for all of history from a one-time event, and therefore, says Shmuel, we cannot learn from the inauguration of the Mishkan that the kmitza must be done for all generations with your hand rather than a vessel. Is that true? Does Shmuel really not learn out for subsequent generations from a one-time event? We learn in the Mishnah. This is a Mishnah in Zvachim. That moist vessels are mekadesh moist contents. For example, a hin or a log measure will be mekadesh oil, will be mekadesh wine, will not be mekadesh flour. Umidas yavish mekadesh nesa yavish, and measures of dry are mekadesh dry, and isaron measure will be mekadesh flour, it will not be mekadesh wine or oil. Ve'ein kle'alach mekadesh nesa yavish, moist vessels, or we'll get to that distinction in a second, are not mekadesh dry goods. Velo midas yavish mekadesh nesa lach, and nor are dry measures mekadesh wet goods. Shmuel says, Loshanu ela midos, aval mizrikos mikadshim. And says Shmuel that when we say that you can't mix, that the moist things are for moist and dry are for dry, that's when it talks about measures. A hin measure or an or a log measure, which is a liquid measure, can only be for liquid contents. And a isaron, which is a dry measure, can only be for dry contents. But something like a mizrak can be used even for dry measures. Now I have a slide over here which depicts a mizrak. Now I have two photos on this slide because that's what I was saying. I think it's a little bit, it seems to be not exactly clear what the mizrak exactly looked like. There do seem to be some accepted, sort of globally accepted principles, which are that the mizrak was some kind of a container that received liquids in it. And also, if you notice in both versions, the bottom is pointy, so you couldn't actually rest it down somewhere. You had to like kind of keep holding it. But other than that, I mean, one version there's like a long handle on it. On the other version, it looks like there's like handles on the side. So it seems like it's not totally clear exactly what it looked like, but it was some kind of a vessel where, let's say, blood could be received in it and then thrown on the mizbeach. So anyways, so Shmuel says that something like a mizrak, which would be, let's say, for Kabbalah Saddam, you can even use for dry, so that's not a measure, right? You don't measure out blood in there, you receive blood in there. And that can be even for dry goods. How do we know? Dichsiv shnei meleim solas, by the Nisim. Also by the Chanukas Mishkan, it says by the Nisim, V'korbanu, I'm reading the pasuk, V'korbanu kairis kesef achas, one plate of silver, shloshim me'em mishkala, mizrak echad kesef shivim shekel b'shekel hakodesh, and a mizrak, shnei meleim solas, and they are both filled with flour. So you see that a mizrak, so Shmuel learns from there that a mizrak, which is generally a liquid vessel, a vessel for liquids, can be used for dry goods as well, for flour. And that was learned out, Shmuel's learning out from the Chanukas HaMishkan. So he is learning out all generations from a one-time event. So Shiny Yosem, but that's different. The Tana Bel Kra Tracer Zimne. Yeah, but the pasuk doubled down on that fact 12 times, right? By every, right, as we know from Parshas Naso, we all know it by heart. I could lay you that pasuk by heart. Who can't lay in that pasuk? V'korbano kais kesef achas shloshim mishkala mizrak echad kesef shivim shekel b'shekel l'shnei milim so less b'shem v'niskol kaf achas asozav midakatoris par echad ben bakar ayil echad kefet echad ben shlozav l'las yerizim echad echad zev echad shlomim bakar shnai milim chamshat milim chamshat zeh korban whatever. Everyone knows that by heart because Parshas Naso, the longest parsha in the Torah, just goes over and over and over again. It drills down this concept that a mizrak can be used for dry goods. So therefore, even though generally we would not learn out from a one-time event, because it was repeated so many times, it's to teach that it can be used for all generations. Okay. But when it comes to the komets, Shmuel would say you wouldn't need to use your hand. You could, I guess, make a vessel for that. Amr of Kahana, Rav Asi L'Rav, Varei Agoshe. But what about Agoshe? that after the mixing bowl is given to the kohen takes it. There's halacha, I wouldn't say a funny halacha, but an interesting halacha. There is simply a halacha that seems to not have any necessary reason, but I guess a lot of these things don't necessarily have reasons. But basically, the kohen takes the mixing bowl and he walks over to the southwestern corner of the mizbeach. That's the thing. Technically, you could just take the mixing bowl and take the kometz, put it in a kometz bowl, and go up to the mizbeach. But no, he first needs to walk over to the southwestern corner of the mizbeach. That's hagasha. Okay, that needs to be done. That's halacha called hagasha. Now, so hagasha, when it comes to this walking over to the southwestern corner of the mizbeach, Titaner be kra v'loy ma'akva, that it says hagasha both in Perek Beis and in Perek Vav, and yet, as we learned in our Mishnah, if the kohen doesn't do hagasha, the mincha is kosher. Mantana Bay, what is it? Where did we repeat hagasha? It says in Perek Vav, Zos Toras Amincha Hakrivosa Bnei Aharon Lifnei Hashem, that the Bnei Aharon take it, bring it before God, and that's hagasha. So the Gemara answers, well, Hahulik Boa La Makom Udasa. What we learned from that pasuk is not that hagasha is ma'akev, but rather, and we learned about this in Masechta Zvachim, but rather we learned about that pasuk teaches us about where the hagasha is to the southwestern point of the mizbeach. How do we learn it? Because in that pasuk it says two important words: lifnei Hashem, before God, i.e., as close to the heichal as possible, as well as pnei hamizbeach, the face of the mizbeach. So we want it to be before God and the face of the mizbeach. Lifnei Hashem, when it says before God, Yachol b'mayriv, so would that be in the west, on the western side of the mizbeach? Tamlomer el pnei hamizbeach, it says the face of the mizbeach. El pnei hamizbeach, it says the face of the mizbeach. Yachol b'darim, well that would mean the south of the mizbeach. Tamlomer lifnei Hashem, well it says before God. Ha'ketzad asom magisha b'karen dromas maravis, it's taken to the southwestern point. Kineged chuda shel karen v'dayo, you bring it to the western point of the mizbeach. The southwestern point of the mizbeach. Yeah, let's look at a diagram. Well, I pulled up this diagram from Daf Nun Ches of Masechta Zvachim. That was a while ago, I guess, a few months ago. These diagrams are so gewaldig. They're so beautiful. These are unique to Babble on Talmud. Nobody else has these beautiful diagrams. Branded. These are beautiful diagrams. I was so happy to see them. And they're reusable. I could just find them and reuse them here. I didn't have to do anything. I just copied and pasted the slide. It took me hours to make this slide. It's to scale, it's everything. This is a beautiful diagram over here. Anyways, so looking at this diagram, so basically you have the ulam and the heichal and everything in that, building, that gold building, and you have the mizbeach there. The mizbeach is halfway, is in the middle of the azara, halfway between the north and the south sides of the azara, the north being the top of the slide, the south being the bottom, the west being the left, and the east being the right. So we see, assuming that the mizbeach is in the middle, halfway between north and south of the azara, so the white arrow is pointing to the western side of the mizbeach. That would be the closest side to the heichos. So that would be lifnei Hashem. But the pnei hamizbeach, the face of the mizbeach, is the way that you go up to the mizbeach, where the ramp is there, where the blue arrow is on the south side of the mizbeach. So if we go based on lifnei Hashem, I would say it's the western side of the mizbeach. If we say pnei hamizbeach, that would be the southern side of the mizbeach. So where does the kohen take it to? So you see where the pink arrow points to, that corner right there, that southwestern corner, and he brings which is both, therefore, satisfies both requirements, i.e. that it's lifnei Hashem, it's by the west side, right, before God, but also on the pnei hamizbeach, by the south side, it's the southwestern corner, and therefore it satisfies both lifnei Hashem and pnei hamizbeach. Okay, back in the Gemara, Rabbi Eliezer, says Rabbi Eliezer, Yochol Yagishenu le Mayrava Shel Karen, says Rabbi Eliezer, is it possible that the hagasha is to the western side of the mizbeach, the droma shel keren, or to the southern side of the mizbeach? Omar Whenever you have two verses, in this case, Lifnei Hashem and Pnei HaMizbeach, Echad Mekayim Atzmo uMekayim Chavero. You can satisfy one and the other. The Echad Mekayim Atzmo Mevatos Chavero, but the other one only satisfies itself to the exclusion of the other. Manichin Eshe Mekayim Atzmo Mevatos Chavero. We leave aside the one that only satisfies one of the requirements. V'tovsin es she Mekayim Atzmo Mekayim Chavero, and we favor instead the verse that you can fulfill it and its contemporary and its companion verse. Sheksha'ata omer lifnei Hashem b'mayrav batalta el pnei hamizbeach. Because if you only go with pnei Hashem, with lifnei Hashem, which is the western side of the mizbeach, you have nullified the pnei hamizbeach, which is the southern side of the mizbeach. B'darim, in the south. Uksha'ata omer El Pnei HaMizbeach B'Darim. However, when you say on the southern side of the Mizbeach, Kayamta Lifnei Hashem, not only is the southern side the Pnei HaMizbeach, the face of the Mizbeach, but it's also Lifnei Hashem, it's also before God. Ve'echa Kayamta, how is Lifnei Hashem, how is the southern side before God? Rav Ashi says, Rav Ashi Kosover Aitana Kula Mizbeach B'Tzofan Koi, because Rabbi Eliezer holds that the Mizbeach was in the north of the Azara, and with that we will leave, that we will end today's daf, but I have one more slide here to depict this. This is another slide that I copied and pasted from Daf Nun Ches of Masechta Zvachim. You see that blue dotted line running through the middle of the Azara. The Mizbeach was just to the north of that line, i.e. was entirely in the northern half of the Azara. That being the case, we see the southern side of the Mizbeach is, the entire southern side of the Mizbeach is opposite the entrance to the Heichal. So therefore, the southern side of the Mizbeach is of course the face of the Mizbeach, but because it's also aligned with the opening of the Heichal, it's also going to be considered Lifnei Hashem. So therefore, by bringing the mincha to the southern side of the Mizbeach, you are satisfying both Pnei Mizbeach and Lifnei Hashem. Friends, we will hold it here for Daf Yud Tes of Masechta Menachos. Well, Daf Yud Tes, I felt that it was like kind of like a normal daf, although I guess it does require diagrams, and I think it was maybe over an hour. How do we get dafs in this Masechta to just be like a half an hour? It's crazy. Anyway, where am I? Right, review. So, we learned about if the mincha oil must be poured by the priest or it can be poured by a zar. The Chachamim, of course, say that nope, it need not be poured by the priest. It can be poured by anybody. Whereas Reb Shimon says, yep, it must be poured by the priest. It was listed as one of those avodas that if a kohen distances himself from that avoda, well, we distance him from priesthood. And then we discussed which steps of a mincha are required, and essentially the rule is whenever it is repeated between the chapter 2 and chapter 6 of the book of Leviticus, well, then those things are required. We saw a nafkamina when it comes to, is there a requirement to use your hand, the kohen to use his hand for the kmitza? Rav says yes, Shmuel says no. Friends, that was Daf Yud Tes of Masechta Menachos. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.